As a driven dentist, you see the world differently. Where some see scarcity, you see abundance. When others want to give up, you keep going. You're building an amazing life of significance. That means you can't rely on ordinary advice from ordinary advisors to get to your goals. You want advice that's going to help maximize your net worth so you can take even better care of the people you love, the causes you care about, and make your dent in the universe. But the fact is, this advice remains hidden because relatively few professionals are well versed in them, and the extremely affluent don't care to let you know about them. Join us as we pull back the curtain to reveal the often hidden advice and strategies used by today's most successful individuals and families. Welcome to Dental Wealth Nation. Here's your host, Tim McNeely.
Hey, welcome everyone to another edition of the Dental Wealth Nation show. And I don't know about you, but one of the things that concerns me is protecting everything that I've worked so hard for. And chances are you're concerned about protecting everything that you've worked so hard for from being unjustly taken, from lawsuit, divorce, or even cyber crime. And that's why today is so important. And I'm so excited because by the time we finish today, you're going to know how to make protecting the assets of your practice easy. You're going to have peace of mind and really a starting point for adding some protections for the data that you have. And data these days is more valuable than oil and gold itself. But most importantly of all, you may feel just a little bit terrified as we share some of the stories, but we don't want to leave you there. We don't want to leave you terrified. We want to leave you optimistic and hopeful that you're going to have the tools and strategies to protect the data in your practice. And when it comes to protecting the assets of your dental practice, Amy Woods is one of the best. And what makes her so great at this is early on in her career, she was a victim herself of cyber crime. So she knows firsthand what it's like to get that call about a data breach. She has a passion for helping dentists move past the firewall and really being able to protect the data that's in your practice from cyber attacks. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, I am just so excited about this topic because data is kind of important these days, and data is valuable, and hackers are out to get this. So give us a little bit of background of how you got started in helping dentists really protect the data in their practice and being protected against cybersecurity attacks.
It really wasn't on purpose. I kind of fell into it out of necessity. So I had been working in IT, mostly for dental practices in Northern California. And it turns out that HIPAA ended up applying to us as a business associate. And about the same time, I decided, let's just throw in orthodontic surgery for fun, because that sounds like we don't have enough on our plates as it is. And during the healing time of that procedure and the second procedure and the third procedure, because it turns out I ended up rejecting my titanium and all my screws started unthreading themselves. And I had to have all of that taken out. About a year after all of that settled down, I got a letter in the mail saying that my dental x-rays, my panos from those surgeries ended up for sale on the dark web, along with my name, birth date, social security number, and my insurance medical record number. And, at first I thought, okay, that's not that big of a deal. It's just dental x-rays. Who cares? And that's what most people think. And fast forward 10 years later, I've experienced financial identity theft, which is really, really hard as a business owner to deal with that. Last year, I experienced medical identity theft. Someone impersonated me to try to procure medical services under my identity, namely, major surgeries. Wow. Not just medications. Yeah. So it's just keeps happening, and it will for the rest of my life. And that was kind of my aha moment that dental x-rays have a lot of value. And, I do a lot of work with various government agencies. And so I have access to information that the general public generally doesn't. And I know that I've been sold about 60,000 times.
Oh my God. So something that happened that over a decade ago is still continuing to impact your life then, is really what I'm hearing.
Yeah, it's delightful. And I realized that dental practices don't really understand the value of the information that they have in their practice management systems or that they're entrusted with. And I never want a dental practice to be met with an angry patient because they're having to deal with all the things that I have to deal with identity theft for the rest of their lives because a dentist was kind of blasé about protecting that the way that they should.
Wow. Now I want to dive in and I want to talk about, just some of the foundational understandings and kind of talk about how dental, technology has really evolved. But before doing that, right, just having been a victim yourself of that financial and medical identity theft, do you think that influences your approach to how you view cybersecurity in a dental practice?
Oh, without a doubt. It shaped how I educate people. It shaped how I look at risk in my own life, in my business, in how I consult with practices and help them set things up, systems and protocols and plans, and making sure that when something goes wrong, it's a minor inconvenience instead of a major catastrophe.
Wow. Okay, I love that mindset and approach, right? A minor inconvenience, not a major catastrophe, because most of us have pretty busy lives. I don't know that I've got room for another major catastrophe. I can maybe handle a couple minor inconveniences, but major stuff I don't want to deal with. So, can you kind of briefly take us through how the technology in dental practices has evolved and some of those implications for cybersecurity today?
It's funny. I was having this conversation over lunch today. So I was talking to my executive assistant, and she used to be an office manager. And I was explaining to her how one of the major practice management systems back when I first started in doing IT, it was kind of the heyday of adding digital X-rays and putting computers in the operatories, back in 2007, 2008, that was kind of when it exploded. And it didn't really work well together. You had to do integrations and extra programs and extra fees, and the stuff was clunky and it didn't really work well together. And now we're looking at cloud systems and programs and vendors that just send out text message reminders, and you can send a text to have someone pay a bill, and you can do a telehealth appointment. And there's so many things that are different. And I think it's really important to understand that in healthcare, we're a little bit behind technology wise. But in general, technology moves at a significantly faster pace than everything else we're used to in a dental practice.
Wow. So even if this is something you kind of went through in your office a couple years ago, it's probably worth revisiting just because of the change of technology today and how quickly things do evolve.
Yeah. Well, and during COVID, a lot of vendors popped up. Innovation came out of that time frame. People were stuck at home and going stir crazy. And so they came up with a lot of really ingenious ways of solving problems.
Mm-hmm.
So just because it works doesn't mean it's necessarily secure.
Okay. Well, and that actually is kind of interesting because, right, HIPAA compliance, you got a lot of vendors that deal with that. They come in the office, they say, oh, this is HIPAA compliant, right? It's one of the questions we've all been trained to ask. And so, is being HIPAA compliant enough? And if the vendors are telling us we're protected, is that good enough? Or is there more that we have to do to protect ourselves?
Oh, there's more. So when HIPAA first came out, we were told we just need a business associate agreement. And that was fine for a good 10, 15 years. But the problem is nobody looks at contracts that they sign. And you'd be very surprised to see what's actually in those agreements. A lot of them actually omit language entirely about who's financially liable. So if a vendor causes a data breach or they have a security incident and the doctor has to pay for it, are they going to get paid by the vendor or not to pay for that? And if you actually read a lot of those contracts, many, many, many vendors in the dental space do not take on that financial burden. So the doctor is left holding the bag and paying for it.
Wow.
It's kind of scary. And then the second part is vetting the vendors and actually asking the questions, not just trusting them. And I have 13 questions I start with. I mean, like, obviously I have a lot more questions that I ask because I'm a little nosy. But also, that's part of a HIPAA risk analysis. You have to vet your vendors, and it's part of your risk. I mean, you're entrusting these vendors with very sensitive patient information, and the patients are entrusting you as the practice with that information. So if you're outsourcing that trust to another vendor, you have to make them prove that they've earned that trust.
Okay. And so simply just asking them if they've got these things in place and having the sales rep say yes, that's not enough, is it?
Not anymore,
Wow.
especially with all the things with cybersecurity and ransomware. And the laws that have changed in the last 10, 15 years. You have to do more due diligence than ever before.
Wow. So even kind of around HIPAA then, right? What are some of those common misconceptions? Because I think we just touched on one is just because the vendor tells you they're compliant, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're protected. Are there some other common misconceptions around HIPAA and data protection in our industry that we should be aware of?
Some of the myths that I have heard are I have an IT provider and that's enough. It's not. I have heard that just move to the cloud. You don't have to do any of this security stuff. They handle everything. That's not true. You still have printers and scanners and email and people that do things. And so that's one thing. I've heard that you'll see an incident right away. And the reality is a lot of these hackers now, they're not being noticed in systems for 4, 5, 6 months. So they
Wow.
have a lot of time to find and exploit information.
Oh my gosh. Wow. And so, right, if do you have kind of an outline in terms of some of the cybersecurity risk, and how do you really look at the practice, right? When you're coming in there, what are some of the cybersecurity risks that we face, and how do we protect ourselves against those?
Yeah, so I mean, cybersecurity is often intertwined with IT, and most people assume that if you have a really good IT provider, that that's good enough. And the problem has been that not all IT providers are created equal. So just like every other vendor, IT needs to be vetted the same way. And there's actually a minimum standard for what you're supposed to have for security.
Hmm.
So it actually starts with 4 things. So you've got antivirus, you've got internet program patches and operating system patches. So think of like your cell phone, you're running your operating system patches and you're running your app patches. It's the same thing on your computers. It's just internet programs instead of apps. So then you've got a business grade firewall, not whatever comes with your internet provider, and backups. And even that standard of care has changed. So it used to be that you could just have a cloud backup and call it a day, but the hackers are now figuring out all those programs, and they're circumventing all the security protocols that used to be built in place. And so now you're expected to have 3 different kinds of backups. And I know 3 different backups, 2 different ways, one of them completely offline and or offsite.
Oh
So
my gosh.
I know it's it's a lot and it's overwhelming. And the reality is most practices can't do this on their own anymore. It's more complicated than it's ever been.
Well, right, and at the end of the show, we want to get to how we can make this easy, because
Yeah.
I'm already hearing it and I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. And my guess is
Have
some
that
of our
effect on
listeners
people.
are listening to this going, ay, 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 what do I do about this? And so, right, this is a large amount of compliance, and it can be costly to not comply with these things also, can it?
It can. That's also another myth that I've heard, that so many people get fines and penalties, and most of the education and sales work that is done by people is scare tactics, talking about fines and penalties. The reality is, there's only ever been 7 dentists in all of the almost 30 years of HIPAA that have ever received a fine or penalty.
Hmm.
Only 7, and every single one of them deserved it. They had egregious negligence everywhere across the board. But it's not that cost that I'm worried about. It's always the mitigation. It's the handling of the incident that costs a lot. It's the attorney's fees. It's the replacing credit and debit card numbers. It's, paying for computer forensics or even just notification letters. I mean, that can get expensive. You could spend $30,000 easily just sending notification letters.
Wow. So it's really not so much the cost in terms of fines and penalties that are going to come from the regulators. It's really more the cost of making this right and restoring your patients and getting this issue fixed is really where the cost is going to be.
Right. It's unfortunate, and it's almost entirely preventable. Just making a plan.
Yeah. Well, do insurance policies cover this? Is this covered in a traditional insurance policy?
No. So this is actually something that's covered under a cyber liability policy. Those words are very important, cyber liability. And the problem is there have been so many cyber incidents and data breaches over the last decade that a lot of those carriers are restricting what they'll actually cover. So I actually just saw a policy from quite a large dental practice, pedo office, and they did ortho there too. And they had a $4 million cyber policy, but it only covered $10,000 in ransomware coverage. So the practice thinks they're getting $4 million in coverage in a cyber incident, but the most likely cyber incident is ransomware, and they're really only covered for 10,000. So that industry is changing right now, and it needs to be thoroughly looked at.
So even if you have one of these cyber policies and you've gone out to your insurance broker, you've heard, hey, this is important, there's a high probability that you may not have enough coverage for some of the breaches that take place then.
Yeah, it's sad and unfortunate, and that's a big part of what I've been doing with clients lately is making sure that, if you're going to take the time and spend the money to get a policy like this, it needs to actually protect you. It's part of that covering your assets.
Wow. Okay. So let's talk about that now, right? We've certainly laid out the issues. We know that there's some, right? You gotta be protected because hackers are coming for your data. And so from your experience, what are some of the simple yet effective strategies and measures that dental practices can put in place to really start enhancing their cybersecurity? How do we start fixing this problem?
So I was telling you before we started today, when I first started looking at HIPAA, it was so overwhelming. I almost quit healthcare entirely. And so I certainly understand why people get overwhelmed by this. And, my darling husband is so calm, cool, and collect. And he just said, figure out how to put it in smaller bite-sized pieces. So it's ironic because the National Institute of Standards and Technologies came out with a cybersecurity framework a few years ago, and they've since updated it. But they really broke this down into 5 pieces. And it starts with identifying your risks and vulnerabilities. And you do that by getting compliant with HIPAA overall and starting with a full risk analysis that includes vetting your vendors and finding out what your risks and vulnerabilities are. And you could do that yourself, but if you want it done really, really well, hire an expert to do it. That's what they're there for. And then protecting your assets is the second point, and that is doing all of the IT security and training your team properly. Don't just do the hospital level. HIPAA is this acronym and it applies to healthcare providers. And I know dental hates the word provider. So, things like that, good quality education that actually makes sense for your dental practice. Step 3 is detecting anomalies, and most dental practices tend to skip this step because it involves something called penetration or vulnerability testing. And it's just scans on your system to find out if someone has hacked in. Step 4 is how do you respond? And that's really having a really good incident response plan. I recently had a client that had a weird issue. Like I somehow end up having all the weird stuff that finds me. They had a thermostat fail, near the server room, and the whole place overheated, and the sprinkler system went off and flooded the whole place, including water flowing right through the server.
Oh.
Which that's that's an electronic, that's, you don't want water near electrical anything. So fortunately, in that situation, I didn't specifically spell out that the thermostat was going to fail and the sprinkler was going to flood the server. That was not specific in the incident response plan. But we had other things like wildfire is a big deal in this particular area, and office flooding could happen. Water heaters explode all the time in offices. You have water lines everywhere. Like, flood is a real possibility in any dental office. And so we had a plan for that. And fortunately, plan A worked, and they were back up and running in under 24 hours.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
In full capacity. But I wasn't worried, because I knew if plan A didn't work, we had plans C, D, E, and F ready to go. Yeah. And I saw that doctor a couple weeks later, and she gave me a huge hug and said, I just don't know how these other offices are in a position to recover like that. And that's actually the fifth step, is how do you actually recover? And that's really practicing your plan and making adjustments as necessary.
Well, and I think what's interesting about that story you just shared is this wasn't even hackers coming in. This was data loss due to flooding, right? Due to water.
Freak accident. Yeah. Completely freak accident.
Yeah. And so really, right, this is really moving beyond the firewall. This is protecting your data, not just from people coming from it, but internal incidences and accidents or hard drives failing, and being able to get your practice up and running again quickly so that you can be taking care of your patients again.
When I was running my IT company, my goal was, if you had to contact me for something, the plan was 5 to 15 minute resolution. And if I didn't resolve it in 5 to 15 minutes, that was a much bigger problem. And it usually involved having to replace a piece of hardware. Because if you have everything together ahead of time, and you've made all these plans and planned for your failures, it shouldn't take more than 5 to 15 minutes. And at that point, if it does, we're both losing money. Okay. So the financial incentive is tied together with the IT company at that point. And it made such a huge difference in the overall productivity and profitability of a practice.
So how do most practices even find out there's been some kind of an incident, right? In the story you just shared, right? Thermostat going out, water in your server, you show up at the office. That's a pretty obvious one, I'm guessing. But, when you're getting hacked, or someone's stealing your data, or, things like that, how do offices usually find out that there's an issue?
The easiest one is if someone gets ransomware, you'll know right away. It happens pretty quickly. You'll get a message that pops up on your screen and says, we took your data, we're selling it on the dark web unless you pay us this amount in this much time. That's the easiest one.
Can you just pause there for a moment and dive a little deeper? Because maybe some of our listeners just aren't aware of what ransomware is. They've maybe heard that term on the news. So can you talk a little bit about what ransomware actually is?
Yeah. So think of it like a computer virus on steroids. Okay. So it's actually something called a type of malware. And it, like 96% of the time, it comes in through email. So it's going to come in through an attachment or a link that's in an email that's bad. And it will run a program on your computer. And because everything's connected in a dental office, it will run on all of your computers and your server and all of your equipment. And it will pop up a window on your screen that locks everything. It basically encrypts all of your data and holds it hostage. So it's holding it for ransom.
That sounds awful.
These people are truly, truly awful. And there is a special place for these people when they die. But for now, this is just the sad reality that we live in, and we have to protect ourselves from this.
So, I mean, you're telling me this is like walking into your office one day, firing up your computers, and you're greeted with a pop-up screen that basically says, you can't get any of your data unless you pay us a lot of money.
It happens more than you think.
That is terrifying, Amy. Absolutely terrifying.
And it's almost entirely preventable. And you can even make a plan for that. I mean, obviously, if you have someone that's really determined and they're really, really good, or, they're generally not solo guys living in their mom's basement anymore. They're highly organized and they're working for their country. They're Russia and China and North Korea, and pretty much every country has some kind of state-sponsored hacking ring. And they like to mess with each other. And unfortunately, we're all suffering because of it.
Yeah. Well, and they're really going for the easy wins. They're not looking for the systems that actually take some time, effort, and energy to hack through, because their whole goal is they want to do this quickly and move on to the next one. Right? The more time and energy it takes for them to break into a system, that's downtime for them, and they're losing money, so to speak.
Exactly. They want the low-hanging fruit, the gazelle at the back of the herd, like that. The whole goal with everything I talk about is don't be the low-hanging fruit. Just you don't have to strive to be much higher than that, but you got to do something now.
Okay. So what are some of those steps that you can take so that you aren't the low-hanging fruit?
So obviously training, making sure your team isn't doing things unintentionally that are going to give you ransomware or cause an incident. Making sure you have the antivirus, the patches, the backups, the firewall, encrypted email, things like that. Making sure all your little mobile devices are locked or that you don't use those. Making sure you have good vendors, things like that. Strong passwords. I know everyone hates passwords, but I saw a statistic on passwords that an 8-character password that's got upper and lower case and symbols in it will take about 8 hours to crack. But if you change that to a 12-character password with that same complexity, it will take about 34,000 years.
Wow.
So something as simple as adding 4 characters to a password.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So we're right now, that's easy to do, right? Those are the kinds of things we're looking for as busy professionals, or what are those easy things that can be done? So, wow, that's amazing. You said 8 hours to 34,000 years. Wow. Wow.
I know, I was shocked too.
That is mind blowing. And so, right, when it comes to security, is this something that dental practices should actually be budgeting for and include in their budget planning? Is just a line item for cybersecurity and those risks? Is this part of the budgeting of a dental practice now that we really should be looking at?
Absolutely. And it's been a frustrating journey for me because most practices lump this into their 6% miscellaneous budget that was outlined decades ago. And it really needs to be separated out. Cybersecurity needs to be a combination of HIPAA and IT. And those things together will make sure that you're not that low-hanging fruit. And if you budget appropriately for that, it's going to pay for itself in your ability to produce and to not spend time on preventable tech downtime.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So just having a budget and realizing that this is part of the world we live in today. The same way we pay for internet and everything else, we need to just be paying for that cybersecurity budget to make sure your data and your assets are protected then.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and we've kind of been touching on this a little bit, but right, how do you really balance that need for robust cybersecurity and also maintaining the user friendliness and efficiency so that you don't get in the way of a dental practice operations, right? How do we make sure we don't make this overly complex?
It has been a challenge for sure. Some of it is because dental technology tends to be a little behind the rest of healthcare. But the good news is a lot of that security is being ingrained in a lot of newer technologies. So had you asked me 10 years ago what I thought about cloud practice management for dental, I would have scrunched up my face and said, absolutely not. It's not there yet. It's not ready. It's not safe enough. But now I'm starting to look at a few vendors and I've made referrals. I'm okay with it as long as they answer all the questions. And I think having that security built into some of these platforms makes it a lot easier for practices to adopt as part of their workflow. And then it's not so overwhelming. It's just built in.
Yeah. And so this is really the work that you do when you come into a practice. Is take me through what you do when you get a call from a practice, or if someone listening today, they're like, man, I just really want to figure out what my practice looks like. Take me through what you do for a practice.
Sure. Well, first, I want to say HIPAA is several thousand pages of regulation, and not all of it applies to dental practices. So we've had to kind of break it down into what applies, what doesn't, what's reasonable and appropriate, and kind of go from there. And every practice is unique, just like every patient is unique. And so I usually start with a lot of questions. I ask what they've done, where they're at, where they think they're at, in terms of security and privacy, and then we do a class. And during that class, it usually comes out from the rest of the team that what the doctor or the office manager thought that things were happening, the team isn't actually doing.
Hmm.
And or vice versa. And so it just allows a really safe place for the team to have that open discussion and have me there as the expert to say, well, what if we did it this way? And then it will accomplish the same goal without finger pointing and yelling at each other. And then everybody feels like they've all had a say in it, when really at the end of the day, I got exactly what I wanted out of it. I got them to do what they needed to do. But, it became a team effort. And so people adopt it better at that point. I am more of a white glove approach, because if I gave a practice a list and said, go write these policies and procedures for technology and security, they would roll their eyes at me and set it on a shelf and never do it. So I do all of those pieces of paper for them. I make sure they have the contingency plans just in case, and they have the policies and procedures if there's ever an HR problem. And making sure they have the right consent forms, because if there ever is a complaint by a patient, you have to have the right paperwork in place. And then same with vendors. I vet all the vendors and make sure you have the right cyber insurance. And then if there is a problem, we have all our ducks in a row. They're not wandering off in the farm somewhere, where we've got a plan in place, and plans B, C, D, and E, and F as well. So, I still do have little incidents, even with clients, but again, they're minor inconveniences.
Well, and I think that's what I keep hearing throughout talking with you is it's not necessarily that you can prevent every single thing from happening, but what you can do is you can be prepared. And that's what the regulators are looking for is, do you have a plan for when this happens? And have you followed best practices to protect yourself? And really, have you put up those I'll use the word firewall, but right, have you put up those defenses to protect your practice? And then that in and of itself is a defense for you and your practice, being able to say, hey, I followed all the best practices. We were doing all the best things, but someone got through anyway. And here's our plan for dealing with it.
In fact, there was actually a law passed in 2020 that, kind of got ignored because we were all dealing with something else during that time frame. But we were a little busy, just trying to reopen practices.
I've suppressed all those memories.
No, I'm trying to forget it. It was a rough couple of years. But during that time, a law was passed that basically said, if you show that you're actually attempting to do these things with both HIPAA and with cybersecurity, and something somehow still manages to get past all those defenses you put in place, then it's considered an accident and not negligence.
Wow.
So you kind of get a get out of jail free card, but you have to have those things in place ahead of time. You can't just throw it in the day after an incident happens and hope that the investigators will let you go.
Oh, that's interesting. So really by following the right protocols, doing the right things, then if something happens, it's accident, not negligence, right? Well, what a big differentiator too for the practice and everyone involved.
It is. It was huge. When that happened, I was like, whoo, this is about time, because I was so frustrated with seeing the practices being treated exactly the same in that situation as, if a practice that had been trying got ransomware, despite all their best efforts, they just had a freak accident, then they were treated exactly the same by the investigators, by patient lawsuits, lawyers, all of those people, as a doctor that had never done anything with HIPAA.
Yeah, right. It just doesn't
That's not
feel
fair.
fair. Yep.
No,
Wow.
it's not fair. So this law in particular, I am thrilled by that.
Hmm. Well, and I would say that that gives the doctors and hopefully, you as listeners, encourages you to get out there and put those basics in place so that you are protected. Not just your practice and removing yourself from being the low hanging fruit, but also protected in case there is that accident now, so that you can actually defend and say, hey, we did all the things we were supposed to.
Exactly.
Wow. So, can you walk us through a case study of maybe someone you've worked through and what the practice looked like, or some of the things you discovered when you first started working with them and where they are now, and some of the solutions that you're able to put in place for them?
Sure. Let's start with the very first one I did. It was the most expensive one, and it was what I call the best worst case scenario. And as a side note, I've done over 400 data breach investigations in the dental space. None of them have received fines or penalties or patient lawsuits or gone bankrupt or closed their doors or anything. They also weren't clients proactively. They were all after the event that contacted me. So this office was one of those. She had had my business card for a good 6 months and didn't call. And over Christmas break, someone took advantage of the basement door having the hinge pins on the outside of the door. And they popped the hinge pins out and took the door off the hinges, and they got in, and they had access to 35 years worth of patient records, paper records, employee records, back in the days when you could ask for all kinds of information. And they took the server, and the server was not encrypted, and it couldn't be encrypted. And the IT guy came in and replaced it with the same hardware, the same unencrypted server. And every step of the way, I was faced with, I don't want to do it that way. I don't want to notify the patients by paper mail. That costs too much money. I'm just going to send an email. And it wasn't the message that was supposed to be sent. It was just, we got broken into, the server was stolen. We'll let you know when we can reopen. How mortifying to write that. It's such an embarrassment to say that. I mean, that could have been crafted a lot better, that didn't make the practice look terrible. And I feel like I missed my calling in public relations, honestly. And in this kind of office and this particular situation, and I do think it's important to note, it was a very tiny 3-operatory practice. And they ended up having to spend a lot of money on physical security. And during the investigation, it turns out that they had outdated computer operating systems. They needed to replace every single computer in the office. The IT guy refused to acknowledge that having a firewall in the office was a necessity. He flat out said, I don't believe in firewalls, and I think encrypted email is a scam. So he got fired. And then we managed to get through all of it. And the investigators put them on a 3-year plan to prove that they were continuing to improve privacy and security in this practice to avoid a fine or a penalty. And fortunately, no patients sued, and no patients left the practice. They were able to restructure everything and talk about it differently to their patients, to let them know that, yeah, your information's already compromised and that's our fault, but we're not going to let that happen again. But unfortunately, in the end, this practice paid several $100,000 out of pocket.
Wow. And once again, it sounds like these were all preventable things that had they done a little bit of preventative work up front, they would have had an accident, not a breach and not negligence.
Absolutely.
Wow.
But, we don't know what we don't know. And to be fair, this was 2013. And during that time was kind of the transition between HIPAA privacy rule and security rule. And dental was trying really hard as an industry to become exempt from a lot of those things. And they kept delaying it. And instead of just embracing it. The Navy SEALs have a phrase I love. It's embrace the suck. And this does. I mean, it truly does. It is a horrible thing that we all have to deal with now. But if we embrace it, it actually takes less time, less mental energy, and definitely less money
Yeah.
in the grand scheme of things.
Well, I know, just right thinking about it, right? You talk about embrace the suck, right? It's almost kind of scary to think about, someone coming in and looking at my systems and looking at my processes and saying, "Hey, you're secure or you're not secure." Like that in and of itself is terrifying. But the reality is, by doing that, you actually add a lot of protection to your office. And so embracing the suck can actually really help build a strong foundation for your practice.
Yeah. I will also say with that I've had a lot of doctors over the years tell me, I don't want you in my office. I don't want you looking at anything until I do all the things. And I would argue the
Mm.
opposite, because even if you're 20%, because no one is 100%. I want to make that clear. No one will ever be 100% compliant or secure, but you're working on a path toward as close to that number as you can get.
Hmm.
And so even if you're at 20%, but you're showing due diligence that you're trying and you're actively making continuous steps to be better every day, every year, every purchase that you make, every change that you make, that goes a really long way when there is an incident.
Wow. So simply, right, once again, documenting those things, showing that you are working with people like you in your office, and really, right, building that data so that you're saying, "Hey, here's what we've been working towards," goes a long way, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I've had offices where they've had nothing in place, or they bought a DIY manual years ago and it's still in the shrink wrap on a shelf collecting dust. And, I go in and I get a good 85% dialed in just in the first 3 months.
Hmm.
And after that, we're making little improvements and constantly improving every year, every time there's a change. And it makes a big difference.
Yeah. So the other thing I'm hearing is this is not a one-time event for your dental practice either. This is an ongoing process. Am I hearing that correctly?
Absolutely. So I think all the listeners really need to understand there's a big difference in how you handle risk management and consultants and even IT than how you did even 5-10 years ago. So I know everyone hates recurring payments on anything, but this is something that you should consider because it's more ingratiated in your day-to-day activities. So most of my clients have me on some kind of retainer where they can call me if there's a little problem. And they do often. It could be, one I get a lot is I gave the patient the tablet to fill out the health history forms, and it had the previous patient's name still on it and all of their information pre-populated. And it's like, well, that's a people problem. Let's fix this. This is easy. But to be able to have someone call me and say, hey, I'm thinking about this new vendor. What do you know about them? Can you help me out? It then becomes someone that's an extension of your team, where you can have that phone a friend experience instead of figuring it out after the fact that you made a bad choice.
Yeah. Well, right. Having done 400 data breaches and who knows how many dental practices proactively, right? You're probably familiar with a lot of the vendors out there. And so, right, a simple phone call of, hey, I'm thinking about using this person can result in a, yeah, go ahead. They're great. I've done the vetting, or stay far away from them.
I try not to say those words. I think
Okay.
that all vendors have the opportunity to be better and to prove that they are truly HIPAA compliant instead of just saying that they are. I
Okay.
have a process that is not that difficult. And I've worked with another cybersecurity colleague that works in dental on the other side of the country as well. And, our systems mirror each other. And so this is a standard protocol that is done in every other regulated environment. But for whatever reason, the dental industry, they've shied away from it for years and years. In fact, I had threats of lawsuits just for simply asking questions of some of these vendors.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, fortunately, I have thick skin. I'm like, great. So you're threatening to sue me because I asked simple questions on behalf of these doctors that they're legally obligated to ask? That doesn't seem very fair.
No.
The good news is a lot of vendors are starting to recognize that they need to be transparent.
Hmm.
So this is a good thing.
Okay. So, let's, I guess we start wrapping up here. Let's pull out your crystal ball, and mine usually is a little fuzzy, but as you look forward, what are some emerging, trends that you see, or some possible threats that we should be aware of? Or right, what do you see on the horizon in this space for everyone out there?
I think a couple of things. Artificial intelligence is a big one right now. There's people using things like ChatGPT in the practices incorrectly. I had one that put all of the patient information into ChatGPT, like their address and their type of appointment they had, and said, write a dismissal letter to this patient. We can't do that, by the way. That's not what ChatGPT is intended for. And you can ask it for a generic template letter and then input your information. That's the right way to do it. There are a lot of vendors out there that are starting to use AI, and they are really cool and can offer a lot of help. But again, they're vendors that need to be vetted properly, because all of that digital information moving around is kind of scary if it's not done properly. I would say also with that crystal ball, people is still one of the biggest risks, because people aren't being trained properly, and they watch the same training year after year after year, and they don't pay attention at all because it's not specific to their job role. It's not specific to a dental practice, and it doesn't make sense for them.
Wow. Well, very, very, very interesting. So the last piece I'd like to touch on before some closing thoughts here are, a lot of the dental entrepreneurs I work with are within 5 to 10 years of exiting their dental practice. Should they have a different approach or a different mindset in terms of thinking about cybersecurity? Is there anything in addition, or, even being able to show a more robust policy? Does that help with the valuation of the practices and the new buyer coming in? What are some concerns and considerations for that doctor exiting their practice in the next 5 or 10 years? What should they be considering?
Oh, it's a big deal. So there's a couple things I want to mention here. If you are looking to sell, or you're gearing up for sale, then you absolutely want to make sure that you're planning to have risk management as part of your budget, because the buyers are wanting to know that the practice will thrive, not just with the number of patients, number of new patients, what their lifetime value is, those things that are calculated, but also, is the practice going to shut down because the computers are old and crummy and there's no security? And am I going to have to spend a whole bunch of money to replace all of this just to be able to function on a day-to-day basis? I've also seen a lot of brokers that are asking specifically about certain risk management programs in place, because if they're currently in place, then the new owner won't have to spend as much to get that practice up to par and retrain the team and retain the team. So I've seen that as well. I have also seen certain situations, like security situations. This actually happened to my former dentist. He decided to close his practice and go work for special needs kids at a hospital. I was really sad about the whole thing, but I'm really glad for him. I'm very happy. He's thrilled. He loves what he does now. And he was kind of a bad business owner, if I'm going to be honest. Great clinician, terrible business owner. And he had a couple of people come in to look at the practice after hours. So team members didn't know what was going on. And one of these doctors was less than honest. And he was there to distract the doctor and plug in a thumb drive to try to export the patient list and contact information so that he could try to steal those patients instead of paying for the patient list.
Wow.
People are terrible.
Wow.
And you would think that that would never happen. I've actually heard of it happen in quite a few offices.
Oh my gosh. Wow, Amy, that's just crazy.
I get the weird stuff.
Yes,
I really do.
Well, you also are out there, right? It's the weird stuff that will get you, though, right? It's the things you're not ready for, that you haven't planned and prepared for. So, Wow, Amy, I know I certainly have a much better understanding of how to make protecting the assets of a dental practice just a little bit easier, and certainly have more peace of mind, and a starting point for protecting the practice would be to work with professionals like you. I don't want to figure this all out. It's too much. I want someone to come in there and really help me do this, and certainly feel a little terrified at the things that can go wrong, but also very, very optimistic that a plan can be put in place to protect the practice. And so before we sign off here, any closing thoughts? How do we get in touch with you? And just like I said, really kind of some closing thoughts on this whole topic of protecting your practice and really making sure that you're prepared for cybersecurity attacks.
Sure. Well, I mean, just don't be paralyzed. Start somewhere. Start small, and it's kind of like everything else. If you start small, it'll snowball into you've got your act together. You'll wake up one day and realize like, hey, I've got a really good plan in place. I'm not as worried about this. And that's a very freeing moment for everyone. So don't be afraid to take that first step. Change a password, make it a longer length with some characters in it. And that goes a really long way. As far as contacting me, my email address is probably the best. It is education@copperpennyconsulting.com. I am very active on social media. It is all under Copper Penny Consulting or under Amy Wood. I'm more active on Facebook and Instagram because I'm an elder millennial, so I barely qualify as a millennial at this point. But so yeah, I tend to be more on Facebook, but you're welcome to reach out to me that way. I'm happy to answer any questions. And if you do want those 13 questions on what to start asking your vendors, I'm happy to share those. Just email me or reach out to me through social media.
Excellent. For our listeners, just put the link down there for Copper Penny so you can check out Amy there. And I would encourage you to reach out. Amy, once again, thank you for being an amazing guest and just really sharing your insights and knowledge with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you to everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you again here soon on the Dental Wealth Nation show.
You've been listening to Dental Wealth Nation. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from the show. Join us next time as we pull back the curtain to reveal the often hidden advice and strategies used by today's most successful individuals and families, and help maximize your net worth so you can take even better care of the people you love. Till next time, make sure to hit the website at dentalwealthnation.com.